Hello, welcome everyone. We're gonna give people a few seconds to join in. So yeah, we're gonna have time at the end of today's webinar for a bit of a Q&A. So as you have questions throughout the session, feel free to add them to the chat. Just make sure you're sending them to everyone and not just hosts and panelists so we can have a bit of a discussion. And as we wait for people to join in, you can feel free to add in where you're calling from in the chat. I'm calling in from Montreal today. We actually are having good weather. It's exciting. Anybody else having good weather?
I just got back to LA from Chicago a few hours ago, and I was surprised how cold it is in Chicago still. I was like, isn't it April? It's like
Right, you were gonna say,
second,
and
like
then
first of April, and it's like I think it was an April Fool's joke that it was like 30, 40 degrees in Chicago.
oh gosh, I thought you were gonna say it was cold in LA. I was just gonna say what? Or
LA is always like 75 and sunny, and today I think it's like 85. So
I feel bad for my fellow Canadian with the freezing rain. Oh,
just
sending
come
you
to
guys
Southern
hope.
California, everyone. Everyone is welcome to Southern California.
That's the spirit. Alrighty. So yeah, so I'm gonna start us off. So welcome to today's Tigerhall webinar. Our session features Nellie Wartoff, who is CEO of Tigerhall and chairperson of the ECLC. And today's topic is how to do change activation for M&A integrations. Nellie, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks everyone for spending some time on a Thursday afternoon with us. The freezing rain, I see you, Rajiv, in Toronto. One from LA. So yeah, enjoying the sunshine in LA. All right, we're going to talk about M&A today. So we've been doing a bit of series around change activation for different use cases. So last week we had one on AI adoption. So if you missed that one, maybe Julia can help me put the link in the chat if you want to go back and look at the AI adoption one. And the week before that, we did ERP integration as well. And when we look at the work that Tigerhall is doing, those are our top three. We do a lot of ERP implementations, we do a lot of M&A, and we do more and more and more AI adoption. So that's about 70-75% of our work. And then the rest tends to be operating model changes, culture changes, and like any other type of change that people are driving. So today we're going to chat about M&A and see where this stands. And I'll be sharing a bit of practical hands-on how you can do this with a change activation platform like Tigerhall and some best practices around when you roll out M&A, what works and what doesn't. So keep the chat flowing with your questions and comments and reactions, and then we'll have some time for Q&A as well towards the end. So M&A then. This is data that has been trending in one direction, I think, over the last 5 years, and it's all the mega deals. And you might have seen this in your respective industries. If you're in consumer goods, you would have seen a lot of this, both divestitures and mergers happening at a very large level. Pharma has gone through the same in financial services. So the deal value is ever increasing, but what is definitely increasing a lot is the mega deal. So we're seeing bigger and bigger mergers and acquisitions happening. And also I would say more at the same time. So what we hear much at the moment is you're running so many concurrent integrations. One healthcare company I spoke with, they're doing like 50 at the same time every year. There's like one acquisition a week because they're getting all of these small pieces together. So like 50 acquisitions in a year. So there are those as well. I would say many that we work with tend to be like, it could be one large one, like especially in the case of merger, that tends to be just one big, but acquisitions, very common to do like 10 to 20, up to 25, 30 a year. So that's something that is definitely increased. And looking at research, people are expecting this to continue. So we're expecting to see an ever greater volume of deals coming up in the next 12 months as well. So there's more and more, just as with any change, more and more happening, but also bigger and bigger deals, which represents bigger and bigger complexity. And that leads to complexity in transformation and change, which is what we'll tackle today, how we go about doing that. Let's start with a bit of a check on who's in the room with this group that we have here. So we've got a little under 100 people with us. So let's check with you guys. How many M&A integrations is your organization managing right now? And maybe now people feel lucky if they just had one. They came in thinking we have this one big thing going on, and now they're like, oh, I'm quite happy to have one instead of 25 at the same time. I'll give people some questions to answer. All right. Okay, so we can share the results. Almost half of you are in the 2 to 10 bucket. That's interesting. So definitely more than one. That's what many of you are doing. Very few are more than 10, 4%. So that's a good thing. Some are non-active, but there is one on the horizon. So that's another good reason to be here. And some people don't track it either. So it might be so many acquisitions going on, it gets a bit hard to track. Awesome. Okay, so many in that 2 to 10, and then some that are upcoming. Perfect. Let's follow that with one more while we're at it. At what stage are you currently in those integrations, or the most recent one? Which phase of the planning and execution are you in? All right, I think we can close it and share the results. So this is where it's a bit more spread out. So many of you are in multiple stages simultaneously. Makes sense if you're doing 2 to 10 at the same time. Some of you 98 days to 1 year, some post-integration, some pre-close. Okay, so we've got a pretty fairly even spread of the type of stages you're in. Awesome. Okay, thank you for sharing. So when we look at M&A, the biggest piece when it comes to especially the change and transformation work part of it, right, is the misfit in the ways of working. So people tend to talk a lot about culture, and culture is definitely one of those. But when we think of culture, it's a word that sometimes can be misunderstood. Like, is it the way we talk to each other, like the way we behave? Like culture, I find at least, means something different in every single company. So while cultural misalignment and culture is a very big part of M&A, and there's a lot of research out there about this, when we think of it, just think of it as like ways of working, like the way that we work, like how we operate, how we make decisions, how we lead, how we develop people, how we do our processes. All of that goes into ways of working, right? And ultimately that forms culture. So, but it's a lot of change happening at the same time, which makes this a lot more complex as well. So when we look at traditional change management in an M&A situation, and when we think of the traditional change management, we think of this as being linear, fairly sequential. You might follow a model like ADKAR, go step by step, and then trying to do this in, say, 5 to 10 integrations at the same time. It's harder and harder to do it in that traditional way because of the sheer volume of change. And I would also add the poly changes, like you have many changes that are affecting each other and many moving parts at the same time. So it's both the absolute volume but also the relative volume into how those different changes are impacting each other. So that makes it very hard to keep up with the traditional kind of waterfall change management plan. And then the biggest thing in M&A is like you have so much variance and variety in like sentiment, like who's impacted in what way. Some people, if you're in a company and there is a company being acquired, if you're in that original company, you might not be impacted at all, whereas others in the same company could be impacted a lot. So the variance in the impact severity and across those different rollout waves just makes it very complex because you have so many different audiences, so many different changes all going on at the same time. So that makes this waterfall kind of sequential approach quite difficult. So one more poll before we dive into change activation. What is your biggest challenge when you're looking at M&A and those different stages that you're in? And then we'll dive into change activation and how we solve for those with that. And we'll give it 10 more seconds. All right. Also fairly evenly spread. 60% of you said managing change fatigue across multiple initiatives and keeping leaders aligned and visible. Both really good one. Measuring was actually working, lowest, keeping pace. Okay, so fairly evenly spread as well, but change fatigue and leadership alignment tend to be big ones. All right. So when we think of a change activation approach, and what change activation actually is, the model is what we call the triple A. So we think of alignment. How do we get everyone moving towards that common North Star? What are we looking to achieve with this merger or acquisition? Adoption, of course. How do we reinforce like what new ways of working are, new processes, new systems, new technologies that people are integrating with? And then adaptation, which is making this entire cycle agile and adaptive to the situation and what is actually happening in reality. So instead of that traditional way of having a big change plan, rolling it out, the plan hits the people and you pray to God that it's going well and then you don't know why it's going south. Instead of doing that, you can have a much more agile approach. So that's the point of change activation, is to have this circular motion where you keep learning, you keep understanding what works and doesn't work, and that feeds your strategy and your alignment. So we'll look at these three and look at some of the best practices when it comes to M&A and some things that you can do tactically to achieve these objectives. So starting with alignment. And when we think of alignment, the number one question that I think is often missed is just like, what are we aligning? What is it that we're even aligning in the first place? And I see many when they're starting an M&A activity, they talk about alignment and aligning leaders and aligning teams and employees, but it's usually not that much clarity on what is it exactly that we're aligning for. So defining very early what is it that success looks like and what are the key pieces that we're actually aligning. Because if you think of aligning an entire company, that's going to take years, right? And the question is not whether you should align everything and everyone and all the time. The question is, what do you do first and in what order? And having that prioritization mechanism around alignment to begin with. Because people tend to be very quick with prioritizing, for example, customer waves, like how do we inform our customers about this, the systems, the tools, like everything day to day in operations, that tends to take priority in kind of like a wave plan. But prioritizing around like what are we actually looking to align on? Is it the reporting structures that go first, and then we go into system and tool changes? Do we focus more on like the shared language and terminology? Do we think that's going to be a blocker? So this is the first space before even getting into the tactics of alignment that I see a lot of organizations are missing. And many times when we come in, it's like, okay, what are you trying to align? Like, what is alignment? What does even alignment mean? And many don't even have an answer to that. So backtracking a little bit before you dive headfirst into aligning everything to everyone, just like, what are we aligning is a good question to start with. And then prioritizing, because it's very hard in M&A to do everything at once. And I know that everything happens at once and everything is like needs to happen within, like there's a go live date and then everyone needs to be integrated, but prioritizing and having some kind of sequential approach to it and not trying to align everything right away is usually key. So start there. We're just answering the question, what are we aligning? And then we can get into the tactics on, okay, how do we actually do this? So when we think of alignment, very critical here, coming back to that large variance that we were talking about, how much difference there is between people, their impact, their workflows, like some just continue in exactly the same systems, processes, roles, reporting line that they had before the M&A activity. Some are everything is changing for them. So being able to personalize it based on who they are, what's changing for them, which legacy company are they coming from, all of these become very, very critical. And that's where you then start looking at like, who do we need to communicate to in what way, what different kind of messages. And that's a critical component because you don't really need to go out with like everything at once. You don't need to do this big bang announcements. And like everyone doesn't need to know everything all at once. But being able to get the right information to the right person at the right time becomes very, very critical. And then what we're seeing a lot of success with is starting with some kind of just like M&A foundational content. So if there's anything that you're doing for everyone, you could do some kind of like foundational content, like what it means for everyone, common terminology. But even that is something that at least personalizing by location or tenure or role is a good place to start. So when we look at personalization, and the way we think about this is think of it as like three different types of data points. So you have your demographics that you can personalize based on. So demographics would include, for example, reporting line, say like who reports to Charles, And say Charles is the CEO, maybe you want to cover one is like 1 or 2 levels below Charles. So that covers your senior leadership team, right? They probably need different information compared to a frontline manager. And then highly recommend including legacy company. So this is a key thing in M&A, right? Is which legacy company are they coming from? And for those of you who are doing multiple acquisitions at the same time, having the selection around like which different legacy companies could people be coming from. So you can, maybe they're coming from both like Bear Builders and Carolina Logistics, for example, if those are companies you're integrating. So that ability to target and segment by legacy company becomes very key in how you personalize and how you talk to different audiences. And then combining that with, say, the workflow action. So if you're moving everyone onto SAP and you have one instance of SAP, being able to see when are people doing something for the first time in SAP. So maybe they're doing a, say like a purchase order. They're creating a purchase order for the first time. If they do that for the first time in the last 30 days, then they need something different from an enablement, integration, alignment point of view than someone who's been in that system forever and might not be from one of these legacy companies, might be from the acquiring company, for example. They might not need anything at all. But you know that the people from Bear Builders and Carolina Logistics, they've never used SAP at all. So being able to segment the ones who are starting a purchase order for the first time, doing that in the last 30 days, that becomes a criteria. And maybe the FMV vehicles, people in the snacking masters, the ones who come from those companies, they're already super well aware of SAP. They're coming from an SAP environment, and then you can differentiate how you talk to them. And then combining that also with how people are viewing the integration, right? So what are they thinking and feeling around this? So if we look at, like take something like AI readiness, for example, like how familiar are you with AI tools in the workplace? If you're introducing a lot of AI, you might want to target people who are at least an 8 and above, for example, in AI readiness. So being able to personalize based on tenure, seniority, popular attributes are like starting date. So if you have an attribute, for example, that says employee start date and target people who are coming in the last 6 months, then you can do specific targeting and segmentation with them. And this is also...
Oh, sorry, Nelly. I just wanted to interrupt you quickly because we have a question that's relevant to exactly what you're up to right now. So Gina is asking, how is this data being collected and input into the system?
Good question, Gina. So this is from the HRS. So think like Entra ID, directory sync, and so on. So when you think of like reporting lines, that's from a HRS directory sync environment. When you think of SAP workflows, that's directly from SAP. So it's live data feeds. It's two-way APIs that feed the data into the change activation platform, and that's how you're able to segment and create. And when you think of the response data, how they respond, like self-assessment, surveys, like sentiment and things like that, that's captured within the change activation platform itself. So you have all of those 3 different ones, very like pre-configured integrations, 2 or 3 clicks to set up, and then you have the data flowing between the two. And if you're looking at something like SAP workflows, then what we recommend is selecting which are the key behaviors and the key like behaviors that people need to take, and then focusing on driving actions in those. So that's how the data gets put into the system. Good question. So employee start date is also one of those. So that would also come from, say, HRS, Entra ID, directory sync. And that's also a good one to think about. For example, if you have new hires, right, they're joining mid-integration, being able to see when they start and where they sit and so on, but also people are joining in at different points from other legacy companies and so on. So overall, being able to determine tenure is a very important personalization point as well. So that's when we look at how do we personalize by the role, the tenure, the legacy company, where are they coming from? And then what you can do with these different groups, right, is then having different kind of M&A content that goes out to them. So something that is common, for example, to be terminology and glossary, like timelines and things like that, that can then be different for different groups. So if I'm part of one of those groups and I'm part of like introduction to the Atlas digital acquisition, I can then receive information, enablement, communication, messaging, and so on directly on Microsoft Teams. So it's delivered on Teams. And then this could be an introduction to this we're acquiring Atlas Digital. What does it mean for you? So this is then based on who you are, who you report to, where you sit in the organization, if you're coming from Atlas Digital or if you're part from the acquiring company. And these are examples of content that can then be built out for these specific audiences. So if you think of this might start with a podcast.
All right. So I know everyone's been waiting for this conversation. I'm here with David, our VP of integration. And honestly, we wanted to sit down and just talk through what this whole Atlas Digital acquisition actually means for all of you. David, let's start with the obvious question everyone's asking. Why did we do this?
Yeah, and I appreciate us doing this because I know there's been a lot of speculation. Look, here's the straightforward answer. Atlas has something we need, and we have something they need. They've built this incredible SaaS platform, and they have some of the best engineering talent I've ever seen. That accelerates our digital transformation by probably 2 years. And honestly, we were going to have to build that capability from scratch otherwise.
So that's an example of what is built out for that specific persona based on context that you feed it. So that could be just any information about what is this integration, right? As simple as a PowerPoint deck, a PDF, like any information about it, and then building this out that is persona based. So instead of doing big, major, like mass email blasts, going persona by persona based on their legacy company and all those other criteria leads to much higher understanding, adoption, etc. And then what you can do are things like how clear are people, right? After hearing about the integration, so they've listened to the 7-minute podcast, how clear are you on what this means for your day-to-day work? And people who go here like, yeah, I'm very clear. You probably don't need to continue bombarding them. Many of you mentioned you have problems with change fatigue, and actually many times change fatigue is just overwhelmed from like too many things. And like people who have already adopted certain things or are clear on certain things, like you don't need to communicate more with them. So if they say I'm super clear on this, like everything is great, then don't bother with that group. But compared to people like I'm not clear at all, then that tells you, okay, this is the group that we need to address and go deeper on to make sure that they understand. So this then goes back into what we just looked at with the personas and being able to target, like, for example, like this one, how familiar are you? This is something that can go in there as well. So after hearing about the integration, how clear are you on a scale 1 to 10? And then you might have timeline. And timeline can, again, be different for different personas, right? So personalization comes in here again. And this is
Hello and welcome. The integration of Horizon and Atlas isn't just a single moment in time. It's a deliberate journey. Today, we're going to map out that 18-month path together, so you product employees. In week 2, new email domains go live, followed by the org chart in week 3, and the wins. New tools, new processes, new colleagues. It's a lot, which is exactly why you're actively shaping it. We've set up dedicated.
So that's an example of a video based on who they are, what their timeline is. And then people can always ask questions, right? So you can be like, what happens in month 10? And then you can see what are the questions that people are asking, at what timestamp is that, and then gets flagged to you like, hey, this is the area that people have questions about. So it's all about being able to proactively address sentiment, questions, concerns, like what are people actually thinking and saying, as opposed to building out this quote unquote perfect comms plan that takes 3 months to develop and another 6 months to build. And then the moment it gets released is already out of date, right? This is a much more agile way of doing it. So those are things you can do. Integration glossaries, terminology, these are super popular to do in M&A scenarios because people coming together like, oh, this means something different in my old company. Now it means something else. So just having people having a shared glossary and terminology. And again, entirely AI generated based on who they are, what's changing for them, which legacy company they're coming from. So this is all personalized based on what they're actually going through in their role. So these are popular examples of what people need to know when they come into a new company. And then you can have a quick check. So, and like, again, another feedback point for you, and also understanding what people's needs are. Like, what does harmonization mean in the context of this integration? And then depending on what people answer here, you can then again target them in different ways and so on, as well as collecting feedback. So like, now that you've seen the integration timeline, what's the one question that you need answered about what's coming? Collecting the feedback, what questions do people have, and then being able to answer those groups that have those similar type of questions.
We have another quick one that's relevant from Marioli, if you don't mind. Can you share an average of manual labor, something like manual labor time this would take as you break it down by audience, department level, etc.?
Yeah, so building on something like this is basically uploading a document and selecting the audience, and then it builds it out. And that takes about 60 to 120 seconds. So 1 or 2 minutes, and you will get a first draft of this. And then everything you can edit, you can go and edit in specific podcasts, words in the video, and things like that. So everything that I have here is all first drafts. So I haven't edited anything in them. But if I want to go back here and change, for example, this word or a new email domains or something else, then I can go and do that. So, but it generates it in 1 to 2 minutes. So I uploaded a PDF that was like just a PowerPoint document, and then selecting the audience that I've set up here, and then it's done. So all the time that is otherwise spent on communications, creating materials, job aids, guides, reinforcement for people, all of that goes away. And this is all generated. And then it's adaptive to how people respond, right? So based on the questions people say, like the timestamps when they ask things, that goes into the system and then generates content to answer those questions as well. So 1 to 2 minutes is the short answer. It's a good question. And then another similar example, like when we talk about like managers, right? Like this is another best practice that we see in a lot of M&A, is things like managers toolkits. So this is something a lot of our customers are doing, is just like, what is a manager's toolkit? Because they're going to be asked a ton of questions. So this is, again, where you can have the context about the M&A. And then maybe here you select, for example, like people report to Charles, say Charles is the CEO. And then you select up to like 4 levels below Charles. So now you have CEO -4, and maybe this is the only criteria in this audience. And then you want everyone who's 4 levels below Charles to actually be equipped with a manager's toolkit. And this could look like something like, how do you lead when you don't have all the answers? Leading through uncertainty. How do you have the hard conversations? A playbook for managers. Culture under pressure. So this is what it would build out for that audience group. Based on what their needs are. Let's see a question from Karen on what program it is software. This is Tigerhall, Karen. So this is Tigerhall, which is a change activation platform. So that's what you can create. And then making like the leaders and managers, so what we looked at just now, having that manager's toolkit where they can go in and understand, how do I answer these questions? How can I have conversations, very difficult conversations, usually during an M&A. What can I prepare for? So that's what you can build out in something like this. So it's like 21 minutes, they can get back to it, and you can separate this by like different audience levels. And this is, again, coming back to Marioli's question, generated in 1 or 2 minutes based on the context that it has, which is usually a PowerPoint document. And in our experience, there is no shortage of PowerPoint documents in organizations. We have a lot of that you can drop in that builds this out. And some other good practices when it comes to equipping leaders and managers, right? So like having these specific toolkits, we see big success with those, and making sure that they get them at the right time. So for example, before performance reviews or before a big announcement or things like that, having them distributed at that time. And then giving leaders access to do this as well. So something we see a lot of is actually when you have different types of initiatives, integrations, giving other leaders accessibility to do this as well. So what you can have, for example, if we have this Horizon integration, different groups that can create content on this topic. So you might have like our transformation network executives and our Canada level 2 leadership. And then you give them the powers to go live, to create videos, create podcasts, like create content, answer like any powers that you want to give them, so that they are not just the receivers, but they can also share things out. And then the benefit is that you then get all the data, you get the governance, you get the visibility, but you give the power to the leaders as well. So that's very popular as well, to select different leadership teams that you can then give access to create content as well. And then the same with having them, having leaders have real-time visibility into team sentiment as well. So a lot of Tigerhall customer, for example, they love using this view where they can see like exactly what their teams are doing, because you can drill down by different groups. So if you want to see what the Canada level 2 leadership are thinking, if you're the president of Canada, for example, or seeing your sales team, and then seeing who's actually influential with that group. So that teaches you that what we should actually put out more messaging from a Simon or a Jeremy. You can see which leaders are people listening to, who's influential, how should we craft our messaging, and who gets to be like putting out the messaging. And you can clone their voices so people can get a podcast in their voice, for example. If you see that Jeremy is very influential with the Canada team, so let's have Jeremy's voice in a podcast go out to the Canada team. So giving leaders access to those kind of metrics as well, and giving them that real-time visibility is a big thing too. A question. I saw Danielle had a question as well. Danielle, do you want to unmute and ask the question? If that works. Or is it a webinar setup, Julie? Oh, no, we have Danielle.
I just gave her permission to unmute. So Danielle, if you can unmute. You should be able to.
Well, I'll answer Rajiv's question in the meantime. Question, during the transition stage, usually 2 different systems processes are running. Exactly. So yeah, when they have new joiners, new system, they have no legacy knowledge, that's where that personalization and segmentation becomes so key again. And then being able to actually personalize based on how often they're doing certain workflows. So if you look at this as SAP workflow, being able to target people who are doing this like at least say 10 times a month, that's very different compared to people who might be doing it like maximum 3 times a month, for example. So this is where you can also personalize based on frequency of workflow, how often they're doing something, like how much legacy knowledge they have in that area. So it all comes back to that workflow. And what you can also do is, for example, the target exactly when someone has done something one time. So this means the first time they do it every month. So if they create a purchase order the first time in a month, they get that enablement, best practices, reference guides, job aids, etc. When they do that for the 20th time, they no longer get anything. So being able to adapt to people who have legacy knowledge and people who don't have legacy knowledge, but also that could be workflow specific, because we're seeing somewhere maybe both have SAP as an example, but they use it slightly different. Like some modules are exactly the same, some modules are very different. And then being able to target people who have legacy knowledge in one but not the other becomes very critical there. No question from Daniel, just button happy.
Okay.
Cool. All right, so that's a bit on alignment and easier ways to get that out and like what works. Now let's take a look at adoption and how we deliver this at scale, right, to drive adoption. So much comes back to that targeting that we looked at, and personalization, segmentation is such a key to combat change activation, fatigue, overwhelm, and it's the same when we look at adoption. And something that we see a lot in M&A, which doesn't tend to work, is when you reinforce through managers and having just managers leading those cascades and you trust them to deliver. But one of the big reasons this tends to fail in M&A is that managers usually are part of synergy targets and they leave and reporting lines keep changing. And the moment reporting lines change and people start leaving and all of that cascade is lost, right? So that becomes a very big challenge. So relying on managers in this scenario is challenging. And when you have things like email goes out, trusting managers cascade it down, very, very tricky. So instead of doing that, what is a much better practice is to trigger it when people have that need. So based on the real-time behavior, and this is what we looked at in those audience segmentation workflows, right? Like someone who has, say, an integration onboarding journey, they're coming from an acquired company into the acquiring company, you might have an onboarding journey for different roles and different teams and so on. If they haven't done that, then they get automatically nudged, reinforced, etc. And then all of these things, because technology integrations tend to be the biggest piece of M&A when it comes to like the day-to-day work. And that's where the moment they start a new workflow, the moment they do a workflow for the 10th time, the moment they haven't done a workflow for the last 30 days, all of those things going into persona targeting is what enables the reinforcement and sustainment to keep going. Because also what the system then sees is that the moment someone drops out, and drops out of like, oh, they did this for 30 days, now it's day 31, and they're not doing it anymore, then the system catches that and say like, hey, Nelly, we see that you did this last month, but this month you haven't. And then it triggers that nudge and reinforcement automatically. So it all comes back to the rules that you design here. And this is why we recommend, like usually if we take ERP only, it's usually between 50 to 100 core workflows, depending on the size and the scale in different teams. But focusing on like a 50 to 100 core like flow processes or workflows or modules is better than doing like everything. Because for example, like annual leave application, the way people do annual leave application, is that going to have a big impact on the success of the merger? Usually not so much. So focusing on things that actually drive the business forward, and making not just reinforcement and so on automated. Because what you also have is with reinforcement, you have it automated based on when people do something or don't do something, and it pops up here within your activity tab on Microsoft Teams. So with Tigerhall, people never have to leave Microsoft Teams, right? They're right there. No need to send them anywhere else. It's already too many places for people to go in life. So just keep them in Teams. And if you have something like Salesforce, if we notice that this is someone that has not taken that action, like reinforcement continues, where they will continuously see, like, how do you master your Salesforce advantage, confidence check, action, knowledge check, like all of these things. And this could be one quick check. It could be a 2-minute video, it could be a 3-minute podcast, could just be a reference document alone, could just be something like this, like the first 5 actions. And that's reinforced the moment they do it for the first time or the 5th time or the 20th time, depending on how it's set up. But everything stays in here and it's automatically part of this activity tab. So they live in Teams. And as you see here, I'm still in the activity tab. So having that embedded based on the workflows is very key. So then they're spaced out and sequenced. And meeting people in the flow work, we notice is a very big change. Like many put a lot of effort with really good intentions to put up great SharePoint sites and resource centers and articles, and people can go and look at it, and then nobody ever goes and look at it. And emails is like email culture is here. I feel like I'm in a meeting every day at this point where people complain about email culture. And it's just very, very hard to get a good open rate. Someone told me this morning that for once they had a 20% open rate on an email, and that was really, really high for them. And that was about a change in compensation. So they're going through tons of acquisitions, multiple at the same time. And this was an email about how your comp is changing. And they had a 20% open rate. So if people don't even open it when it's about their own compensation, like then you have an issue, right? So when we see it's delivered in the flow of work, like on Tigerhall across the board, we have about 87% engagement, and that means open it, complete it, consume it. That's about 87%. So if you're sending out something to 100 people, you know that at least 9 out of 10 are going to see it and consume it. And that's because it's bite-sized, easy to use, easy to consume, and it's already where they are at that time when they need it. Because delivering everything in like a workshop fashion in January and saying like, hey, we have this new workflow, everyone goes into a classroom, we have this 4-hour training, then someone starts that workflow 6 weeks later, they have no memory of that training whatsoever, right? So being able to tie all your change activation to when they do something in specific workflows is by far the biggest driver of adoption. And then coming to adaptation, when we look at what is the data and how do we continuously adapt, because again, change activation is very much about being agile, about the 2-way feedback loops, continuously listening, learning, and adapting based on that. So it's very, very fast. It's very fast turnaround cycles and launch cycles and so on. And that is what leads to the speed that change activation delivers, as opposed to a traditional change management method, which is more linear in its fashion. So let's look at how are you measuring integration success today? This was the lowest one in the poll that we did earlier. So I'm curious to see, for those of you that said measurement is a challenge or a focus area, how are you measuring success?
If you want to ask another question in the chat that is relevant to this.
Yes, compare the number of change comps resources needed. Yes, we do, Gina. We have quite a lot of materials actually, like the before and after. I think I have one of the like high level slides in this deck shortly too. But overall, so when we do large M&A, and we have a couple ongoing now that are like 20,000 to 50,000 people in total affected, And then we have a number that are like a few hundred people who do like many small acquisitions. We have one that is like 135,000 employees, so that's probably the biggest one. But overall, coming to your question, we usually work with a 1 or 2 person team. So 1 or 2 people doing everything end to end. And in a traditional approach, doing everything, like if you add in the personalization and everything, that would be a team of like 40 to 50 FTEs. And they're doing this with 1 or 2 people. And a big reason for that is all the reduction in content creation. So think of all the time that goes into creating training materials and job aids and communications and liaising with executives to record something for a town hall and getting approvals for communication, like all of that goes away. So in Tigerhall, you have automated approval flows. So approval flows happen in the platform. You can clone executives' voices, so you don't have to record them. You can just create a podcast and it's already in their voice. So all of that time is reduced massively. And then add to that the time usually taken for feedback, analysis, surveys, gathering all of that. That's already in platform. And then the third bucket is analysis. Because something a lot of people tend to spend time on is gathering data from, like, you go to IT and HR and like try to pull together so many different data sources. Whereas in Tigerhall, you just have all the data there. So content creation, all the operational overhead and reporting tend to be the biggest ones. Translations, yeah, so we support 33 different languages. So that's another piece that tends to take time. And here it's instant. So if you go into any kind of content piece, you have 33 different languages and the end user can set their language. So if I'm in Japan, but I still want everything in, say, Spanish, I can get it in Spanish. So I just set it to Spanish. But if I want to listen to it in Japanese or read in Japanese, I have that option. So you always have 33 different languages that you can choose from, and that's instant. So if you're doing a live stream, for example, you can have that live translated and subtitled in all those languages too. So yeah, so that's another big saver from a time perspective and of course a cost perspective too. Okay, how are people measuring? Employee engagement, sentiment surveys, biggest piece, 29% do that. And then we have some manager feedback. Total reporting was the lowest. Talent retention, and quite a few, actually, most of you don't have clear metrics yet. Okay. All right. So let's look at metrics then. And if we don't have clear metrics, what is it that we could be getting? So feedback loops, so I keep coming back to the circle. This is what I talk about like a parrot all the time. Like it's about data is not only an output, data is an input. And when I look at how people run this traditionally, it's very much like reporting goes into a deck, goes to the steerco, and data is like the report, right? Whereas in change activation, we use data as the input. So if we think of rolling out to different waves, different groups, different client segments, you learn from all of them to then do it better next time. And also even things like, how do we best engage a Tom and a Sue versus Brittany and a Bob, for example? Just the difference between those two, the system learns so that you can then better engage and activate them over time. So better targeting, better personalization, faster ramp up, you get to the right people in the right way, and then you can continuously improving those outcomes because the system just keeps learning and keeps getting better as it gets to know the audience. So the feedback loop is the first part of collecting that data. And that's the other benefit of using a platform, right? Is that you get all of this data. Sometimes I half joke that Tigerhall is like the Cambridge Analytica of change because it's collecting all the data, including, do people go back to something? Do they watch it twice? Do they stop midway? Do they forward it to a colleague? Like everything they're doing on the platform is captured. And then contrasting what we call explicit feedback with implicit feedback. So your explicit feedback might be someone commenting and saying, hey, great acquisition, everything's going super well, love it. But actually they just like sped through the podcast, they skipped the video, they're not engaged, right? That's what we would call a fake engaged person. So they want to look like they love it and everything is great and they're engaged, but actually they're not. And then you might have the opposite, which many times happens in Asia, for example, like people are not that vocal, but you can see that they keep going back to a specific job aid or they reference this and they've shared it with colleagues, etc. So being able to look at both of those sides of feedback loops and both of those types of feedback to feedback into then compound over time is a very key part. And then you have things like change saturation. So being able to see like collision points and looking at how overloaded are different people at different times. And this is where we look at those, what I just mentioned with explicit feedback, implicit feedback. And then you also get data like this one, for example. where you can then see tracking all the different work streams, all the different initiatives, the different projects that are going on within an M&A, and then seeing who's impacted when. So this enables your planning to be much better when you can see like, oh, the product team is super overwhelmed in May. Maybe let's move something forward to April or something later to June, so that it's much more targeted to when they can actually absorb it. Because people do have a finite ability to consume change as well. So this allows you to then plan. So being able to look at the sentiment, like how much overwhelmed there are, like saturation in real time, and seeing that flagged allows you to better plan these different waves as well. Cannot manage what you don't measure. That is very true. Exactly. So all of this then comes down to how do we build for scale? And when we think of the work that we're doing in our customers, it's a lot about scalability. And how do we do this at larger scale when there is more and more change coming, bigger integrations, bigger acquisitions, more acquisitions? And the governance model that we see most are taking is you have the smaller integrations kind of running with like these off-the-shelf toolkits. So very, very automated at very large scale. So if you think of that manager toolkit as an example, that's something that you can very easily personalize different toolkits to different groups, different seniority levels, and just have that run as a standard for smaller integrations. And then you can have more dedicated resources to more super high complex, very large integrations. So super simple operating model, but like how most tend to do it. And then they can focus on hand-holding those bigger pieces, but scaling majority of it through technology without adding more headcount to the team continuously. And I've shared a bit about Tigerhall and how that works, and I keep coming back to this loop and the agility all the time. What we looked at in some of the pieces that you saw are like the dynamic personas, how we build those out based on demographics, workflow actions, the response data. So being able to tailor it, and this is where we see, this is like the foundation of the platform, the power of it, the results is because of this personalization, both in who they are, but also the time. And if there's one thing I've learned in the 8 years I've been doing this, is just how much time matters. And that's the biggest thing we see in the data, is the timing when someone receives something. That is what drives adoption by far the biggest. So that's an important piece there. And we saw some of this, the personalized content. So this is what the system creates entirely. So you don't have to spend time on this. The languages that you asked about, Gina, so those are here. And then it's delivered. Teams is the most popular integration. So last year we had 63% of usage was on Microsoft Teams, also supporting Slack and Google. Like the point is to be in the flow where they are. So there is no change management required to have them go to yet another place and more destinations and so on. Capturing a ton of feedback because of that high consumption rates, 87% consumption and engagement, leads to all of the intelligence that you get both around the personas, who's influenced by who are some of those hidden champions that you might want to activate, and also that initiative-wide view of things like collision points and change load and how can we better plan. So that's a little bit about how that circular motion works in a change activation platform like a Tigerhall. And the before and after, someone asked about the number of people, for example, and realize it's not in the slide, but we can send some resources after. But it's usually comparing like scattered comms across so many different places. You have very low engagement. Email culture keeps coming up and something that organizations are struggling with. And cascading, especially in an M&A situation, cascading tends to be the lowest performing because of the synergy targets and people leaving and operating reporting lines and so on changing. So that tends to be a challenge. So instead of doing it this way, is very much about the personalization, high engagement, having reinforcement, sustainment, all of that automated based on the time, and being able to see the data in real time. So seeing things like the adoption, the saturation, sentiment, what is actually happening. So it allows you to do much more pinpointed and targeted interventions. And when you get this right, the ultimate outcome we see of doing change activation well in M&A is the speed of getting to the finish line. And that's frankly true across AI, ERP, and all the other types of changes too. It's just about how quickly can you get to the results and get the business results that you're looking for. Adoption rates consistently see, like with that personalized delivery in the flow when they need it, over 80% engagement, and adoption rates consistently in that like 90% plus, many times within just like 2, 3, 4 months. So it goes very quickly. And then being able to keep the people that you want to keep, right? That's another important point. When there's more clarity, people are more in the know of what's happening, what's expected of them, you see fewer people leave. So but I would say it's speed and adoption rates are the two biggest outcomes that we're seeing when we're looking at people who do this really well and organizations that do this really well. So some of the key takeaways, more and more M&A volume. I mean, you're no strangers to this. This is probably why you're on this session this afternoon. Starting alignment early, even before day one. So good practice, and personalizing that by where are they coming from, what's their legacy org, what's their tenure, their role, etc. And then driving adoption of all of those new systems, the workflows, everything they need to be involved with. Doing that in an automated fashion and not relying on managers to cascade, but having it delivered when people need it. And then looking at the data, so adaptation, that's where everything comes in, because that's what allows you to pivot and what allows you to target different groups better and be more targeted in your interventions and knowing what to do and what not to do. So instead of like peanut butter spreading one approach to everyone, you know exactly what to do with each different person. And then this compounds over time, right? And I realize I sound like a broken record at this point, but this circular motion is really the power of it. And the fact that data becomes your input, the fact that you can target based on data, understand based on data, intervene based on data, and having those pillars compound over time. So some next steps before we get to maybe some Q&A. So looking at your current integration approach, are you segmenting in enough detail? That's usually the 101. And I still see so many organizations going mass communication when it comes to M&A. And I'm not saying do nothing mass, but think about who really needs to hear this and who really needs to hear it now, and what do we need to go to everyone with. And it also depends, like, would you rather have mass comms and then maybe some change saturation? Many of you struggle with change fatigue. So think about that segmentation part of it. And then the prioritization, what are those hygiene factors? What are the must-do key behaviors? Don't try to align everything at once and integrate everything at once, but like, what are the core behaviors that you should start with right away versus what can employees absorb more organically over time? Data-driven approach to measure. And like what someone said in the chat, you can't manage what you don't measure. So start measuring, and execution drives a lot of that data. And then having these reusable activation playbooks, especially for those of you that are in organizations that do volumes of acquisitions. Having those templates, the toolkits, and so on, many of those can be reused, especially if you're a big company that are acquiring many small ones. There's a lot of scalability that you can gain in that. And then, of course, if you want to see more of Tigerhall, I've showed you some pieces today, more personalized demo specific to what you're going through, and how you can leverage these in different pieces, then don't be a stranger. And of course, reach out, and happy to chat more. So those were some things I wanted to share in terms of what we're seeing works and some of the tactical things around how this all comes together. Any questions that we haven't covered so far? I see two here. At one point in a transaction are typically brought in. Any point actually, Gina. So both like pre-announcement. So sometimes we come in together with, like, it's usually a big consulting firm, and we partner with many of those, and then they bring us in even like pre-announcement to like prep and plan and like actually do the internal announcement on Tigerhall as well. So that happens. And then also, I mean, we've been brought in like a year after the M&A when everything is going south and people are realizing this is not a good way to do a merger. Then they bring us in as well. So I would say the ideal time to bring us in is around the time of announcement, but it could also be earlier, it could be later. If I look at divestitures, for example, like we did Kellogg, when Kellogg's were splitting into Kellanova and WK Kellogg, we were brought in kind of like the day that was announced. And I think that was very ideal, but it could also be up to a year later. We have seen those too. Rajiv, is there any way to track synergy targets in the system? No, there's no way to track that in Tigerhall, but we do integrate with tools like Smartsheets and Power BI and data lakes and so on. So what many times happens is you take the Tigerhall activation data and feed that in to see like what actually leads to synergy targets. So most of our customers see Tigerhall as like leading indicators to ultimate financial ROI. And if we look at things like system integration, tool implementation, we many times see what are those early behaviors, early adoption signals that then leads to that financial ROI being realized. So many times take the data, feed it into a data lake, you can visualize in Power BI. We do that for many of our customers too. And that's how you then like track synergy targets. But we don't track it directly inside the platform.
We have another question that's anonymous that happened earlier in the webinar. You can do all of this with Tigerhall and integrate into Teams for delivery. Can you share more about how that works?
Yeah. So everything that I showed is on Tigerhall. So I started Tigerhall 8 years ago. I was a mid-level manager in a large global organization and just thought they were doing change really poorly. And like, why is everything in these 100-page PDF documents and we keep getting slides for everything and they bombard us with emails and like nothing is changing behavior, actually helping people through this change, right? So that's how I started the company. And everything that you've seen today is with Tigerhall. So if we look at how that works, and coming to your question on teams and integrations, today we have over 750 integrations that are pre-configured. So it fits super nicely into most large tech stacks of organizations. So some of the top ones that we integrate with, like Workday, Salesforce, SAP, that feed those workflow actions. And then Teams is literally a 2-click to get it onto Teams. So for those of you who are in Microsoft Teams, you can even go to the App Store right now and search for Tigerhall and you will see the app pop up. And then it will say something like, ask your administrator to add it. So we need the right person to authorize it. And it's 2 clicks. And then Tigerhall is added to everyone's Microsoft Teams environment. And then everything is on Teams. So because I don't believe in people like sending people to 17 different destinations. And I usually compare like going through a change in that fashion is like watching a Netflix show when you see the second half of episode 8 before you see the first half of episode 2. And you're like, what's the plot again? Like, who's the bad guy? And you're trying to piece it together between a town hall and there was something you missed in the inbox. And then there's something in the LMS, something in the intranet. And you're just like, what is happening? And I think that's a big piece that leads to so much confusion and change fatigue and overwhelm, is that there are 17 different places with 37 different types of information. And we put all of this on the employee. We put all the onus on them to like, hey, like now you go into this jungle and figure it out and go into SharePoint, and good luck if you find yourself on the way out again, because no one ever does, because you just get lost in there. So a key piece of this is have it on Teams, if that's where people are, or Google or Slack, whatever you operate on. Reach people directly through direct messages. So now like this is Tigerhall because I'm logged in, but this could be your name, your company's name, like Disney, this is Mickey Mouse. Like you can be creative with it. It integrates with channels. So if you're part of like field operations managers and you're affected by this merger in this way, you can have pieces coming up here as well. So people can then just consume it right where they are. It's integrated here. You have it in the activity center as we looked at. So this is where they can have the reinforcement happening right away. You have the app embedded. So everything that when it comes to creating content, setting up those the target personas that we looked at, stakeholder groups, all of this is within Teams as well. So deeply embedded in Teams and many other integrations, and very easy to set up. It takes about 60 minutes with one person on your technical team to get it all set up. So that's one of the big pieces of feedback we always get on onboarding is like, oh, this was so much easier than I thought. This usually takes 18 months and now it was 18 minutes. So it's easy to get going.
One last quick question, and it's a bigger question about M&As in general. So do the majority of M&As still provide financial benefit to all parties at the highest level, as the senior management and brokers spreadsheets forecasted? If not, why do they keep doing them?
Yeah. It's a very good question. I actually many times ask that as well. I'm like, why? Because all the data, all the research points to that M&A is actually not a good idea. And it's actually not realizing those financial benefits many times. I think the reality is that many times it's also ego. Like big companies, big executives want to have even bigger companies and bigger organizations. And if I think of like the tech world, for example, like it's a lot of ego in there. Like people want to buy a company. And frankly, also many times like executives get bored and then they have to go out and buy a company to have something to do. Like I've heard many of those stories too. I think the answer to why companies keep doing them is a bit of like, it always sounds good and you might want to like kill a competitor many times. I mean, Microsoft are notorious for doing this, just buying companies to kill them. And there are many others who do that too. So I think various reasons, but I do think there's more, let's call them human, emotional, political reasons than there are financial reasons many times, fortunately or unfortunately.
so that was all the Q&As that we had. So Nelly, do you want to wrap us up?
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for spending time. Everyone who wants to have another chat about this or dive deeper, feel free to email me directly. I'm on nelly@tigerhall.com. Reach me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. So I look forward to connecting and having more M&A conversations. And view me as a resource. So anything that I can do to help you at any time, please feel free to reach out. And thanks again for the time.